So, after case 4, we would consider whether or not voluntary choices definitely result in commitments that must be honored by the mother on the part of the fetus. And Thompson gives us reasons that she believes justify rejecting that idea. She turns her attention to another kind of argument that she thinks one might give, uh, namely that even though it's not clear that in all cases we have an obligation or that the person has a right to our assistance, when it's easy for us to provide that assistance, when it doesn't dramatically impact our life, then surely they have a right to that assistance. And she wants to deny this line of argumentation as well. She wants to say, look, even when it's easy to provide assistance, it's not the case that the person has a right to your assistance. Even in cases where we think, yeah, you ought to assist them. And so she wants to argue that there's a difference between thinking that it would be a better world or that uh, people would be praiseworthy for assisting them and being in a position where they, in fact, have been granted a right. And she says, even ease of action doesn't grant you necessarily a right to something. And so she asks us to consider two permutations of her previous examples. So she says, imagine instead of 9 years or 9 months and so on, the violinist to survive just needs to be hooked up to us for an hour. They get hooked up to us for an hour and then they will live. And this is how she thinks the logic of this argument should go. The idea now is that, well, look, we ought to do that. Right? It seems like we really ought to assist them. But she says we need to be careful from going from thinking, yeah, it would be a good thing to assist them, to they have a right to our assistance. And she says that even though the violinist could be saved by a mere hour of our loaning them our kidneys or our body, right? That doesn't mean that they have a right to demand it of us. And she looks at another case that she's considered before, that case of Henry Fonda. And she said, well, sure, you may say, well, it'd be hard for Henry Fonda to, say, fly across the country from the West Coast to MIT to lay his cool hand on your fevered brow and cure you. But what if Henry Fonda was in the hospital and was called into your room and merely had to walk across the room? She says, well, surely one would think, yeah, you ought to do that. Really not going to be much of a burden on him. Save your life, right? Yeah, you ought to do that. But, as she wants to argue, that doesn't mean that you have a right to his assistance, that he has to do it, that he should somehow be compelled to do it. And so she wants to distinguish between actions that we think would be morally praiseworthy and actions that she thinks are required of us because someone has a right. We have an obligation to perform in a particular way towards that person. And she thinks that ease of doing something doesn't actually establish a right of that person to expect you to do it. And she also wants to consider the implications of that claim for abortion providers. So you might look at that case and you might say, all right, look, I can see what you mean. Right? It would be easy for Bill Gates to make me a millionaire. Poof, wouldn't even notice it, probably. Probably something like a day's profit for him. Right? But that doesn't mean I have a right to demand Bill Gates give me $1 million. So we can sort of see that there's a difference between ease of action and thinking maybe even these actions are the sorts of things that are morally praiseworthy or that would result in a better world. If people were just this way, wouldn't things be much better? From the claim that you actually have a right to them acting that way, that they have an obligation to act that way. And so she wants to consider also what about these people who are aiding or facilitating this other person in escaping this action, which we now can sort of think of as being a good Samaritan. Right? So suppose we recognize that we can't really force people to act like good Samaritans. That is, to behave in supererogatory ways that go beyond what can reasonably be expected of people. Suppose that we recognize that we can't force them to do that. What about prohibiting people from assisting them in escaping those actions? She says, we may argue that, well, we can't force a mother to keep a baby to term, but surely it's morally impermissible to assist her in escaping an action that really doesn't demand that much of her, but would result in the life of a human being who has a right to life. And so she wonders whether we can compel people to withhold assistance to a person who seeks to escape actions of good Samaritans. And she says, again, if we don't think that the person is obligated, ethically commanded to do some action, even if we think the action is morally praiseworthy or superlatively so, aiding them and avoiding doing that action, again, doesn't seem morally despicable. And so she says, when we think about Samaritans, we can make a distinction between good Samaritans or superlatively good Samaritans and minimally decent Samaritans. And to illustrate this point, she brings up this case, this terrible case of a woman who was brutally assaulted and murdered. And 38 people heard her, were aware that this was happening to her, and none of them helped her. Now she says we can distinguish different gradations of Samaritanship here. So someone who risked their life or health to go down and help this person ward off the attack. Now we might consider that to be a good Samaritan. We might even consider it to be a superlative Samaritan, morally praiseworthy, right, and so on. But certainly not something we would require of people. We might think, yes, but a minimally decent Samaritan, something that these 38 people didn't rise to either, would have just called the police, right? Engaged in this minimal disruption of their activities that would have at least resulted in the woman having a chance to survive this assault. And so we might say, well, look, in the case of a minimum Samaritanship, surely we might be able to require it of people, and even more to the point, we might be able to require that people not assist them in escaping those kinds of obligations. So even if we think that the person isn't morally obligated to call, that this woman who was being assaulted had no right to expect these people to call the police to save her, surely we can say that it's morally impermissible to, say, lie to help these people cover up what they did, right? To somehow facilitate their not taking any actions. And here she said we need to think about how we want to characterize this action relative to other sorts of standards of Samaritanship. And so when she thinks about this case, she says, well, we're not asking somebody to devote 5 minutes of their time to something. We're not asking them to save vote or to help old ladies across the street and so on. We're asking them to devote 9 months of their life to harboring another being inside them, to take some medical risk in order to bring the pregnancy to term, to disrupt their life, possibly, you know, get social stigma associated with them and so on. And so she says, that's what's being argued as a relatively insignificant inconvenience here. That's what has to be the standard of a minimally decent Samaritanship. And she says, if you look around, she says, the consensus reflected in the laws of countries and the mores of normal individuals isn't that that is a minimum standard of minimally decent Samaritanship. She thinks that this isn't the case of someone who they could have just picked up the phone and possibly saved someone's life. This is a different standard, a standard that we think is supererogatory, that is beyond what we can reasonably expect of people. And so she thinks that we can't force people to be Samaritans of this caliber, nor can we expect people to withhold their assistance when they're asked to voluntarily aid that person in escaping Samaritanship of that caliber.